Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Mostly the Same, a behavioral science show about human decision-making in different countries and different cultures. I'm joined today by Tareef Jafferi, the founder and CEO of Happily.ai, a gamified employee engagement app that uses pulse surveys to help provide its customers with insight into employee engagement in a company on a near real-time or daily basis. So, Tareef, welcome. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
So, I thought what we might be able to talk a little bit about today is, one, let's give you a minute to introduce Happily.ai maybe a little bit better than I did. I know you use pulse surveys.
Yes.
So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. The whole idea of Happily is to be able to understand people better at work. And I think that when we did surveys, when we made it an annual thing, activity, we didn't really capture what was really happening at work. And we wanted to try to figure out how can we get data that's actually meaningful and that we can use that data to actually create positive action and change in the workplace. So that was the idea behind Happily. Now, getting data on a real-time basis is difficult. Right? How do we do that? How do we get people to want to share truthful information with us? And that's kind of how Happily became a game, where we want people to come in and actually be highly engaged because they want to share. They want to create conversations with the people that they're working with. And that way, we've been able to get a lot of engagement, but most importantly, we're getting truthful information and we're creating positive interactions and habits in the workplace that we really want to have that make us more resilient and make us happier at work.
Yeah, we all want to be more resilient and happier, especially at work, I think.
Yeah.
So, listen, I think one of the things that can be of some value to our listeners is Thailand and Southeast Asia, more broadly speaking, are areas that maybe don't get enough airtime. Particularly as we talk about how employees work and various challenges that we might face. There's lots of research that's come out of Canada and the UK and the US, but I'd like to shine a little bit more of a light on this part of the world since you're based in Bangkok and so am I. Mm-hmm. And so I think in that light, could you talk to us a little bit about some trends and patterns that you've seen emerge, particularly over the last, I would say, 9 or 10 months as we've faced some different unique challenges in a world of business?
Yeah, sure. I think Thailand is a very interesting space to understand people culture because I think there is a lot of tradition of what work culture used to look like, but then also a very quick change in terms of the new generation coming into the workforce that have quite different way of thinking than maybe previous generations. So I think there's a lot going on. It's extremely dynamic. When we look at annual statistics and reports, it's always seen that, okay, Thailand, maybe the workforce has very low engagement scores compared to their neighbors. But when we actually do a more frequent study, we've actually found that not to be true. So I think we're learning a lot more about what work culture really is about, and what that means to the actions that we should be taking. I think over the last 9 months, I think it's not dissimilar to a lot of other places where there's a lot more attention to things like employee well-being. Thailand is, I think, one of the first places to come back to work where a lot of other locations might still be working remotely. So I think there's a lot to discover there too. Like we're seeing what workforce will look like when they do start coming back. So I think there's a lot to learn there too. And how culture influences that. But yeah, a lot of stuff, but I think it's all positive. I've been very surprised to see how resilient people have been at work, how much employers are caring about the well-being of their employees and the things that they're doing and the actions that they're taking. And the Thai industry is affected because of tourism and all of the things that are core to how this country is, and I'm sure recovery is coming and soon. But in the meantime, workplaces are going to be strained a bit, and how can we understand that a bit better, so that we can improve them in the right ways?
So I think the topic of well-being is interesting. So Thailand is, I think, a market that many of us might not understand as well as you do, and even me. I've only been here since February, so I'm still searching for meaning and understanding of the corporate environment here. Mm-hmm. So you say that companies have focused on employee well-being here. What do you mean?
I mean, a few things. Because in us trying to help companies, look at how they can improve their employee experience and engagement, we always we have conversations around what they want to be better at, right? And there's always going to be talks about organizational capabilities, right? We want to be better at maybe driving better feedback in organizations, or we want our leaders to be a certain, has built up the certain capabilities. Those were previous conversations that we used to have, but today it's quite different. The priorities aren't there anymore. Like, not that they're not important, but what has taken priority are things like, how do we make sure our employees are safe or feel safe when they come to work every day? Right? They're coming to work. A lot of places aren't working remote anymore, so they do care not only about whether they're safe or not, but do they perceive, like, what is their perception? Because even though the workplace is safe and they're taking all the measures to make them safe, if a person doesn't feel safe, that already is not okay. Right? So I think it's just the attentions that they pay to those things. That's been a very, very pleasant surprise. And then the other part too is that with work, some of the work still being remote, there's a lot of conversations around how do we make people feel connected again. I think that there's a mental well-being aspect, not just about feeling safe from getting the pandemic or being affected by the pandemic, but it's just how can we make people feel more whole at work, but still meaningful. And because when you're disconnected, your mental state is not the same. So I think that there's those two sides that are being focused on that we never really had to focus on before.
Well, it's a good transition to make. I mean, basically what you're saying is you've noticed a shift from, let's call it KPI-driven work.
Sure.
Where you've said the organization is focused on capability building or capacity building, which is a fairly dry way of saying we have a set of skills that we need our employees to have and we need to invest in order to bring them up to code, if you might say.
Sure.
And it sounds like we've moved a step or two beyond that in Thailand, where we've said, well, listen, we still need that, but in order to get that, we need to know that, do our people feel like they're safe coming to work? Because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to be able to focus on anything beyond that.
Exactly.
And so the second piece that I think was interesting as well was, listen, like you talked about the need for safety, and you also talked about the need for meaning. Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's core to what we would all want, wherever we come from, whatever walk of life. I mean, we don't just do a job so that we can get paid. Obviously, that's part of it. But we want to use our skills, and we want to feel that we're accomplished and that there's meaning to what we're doing. Yeah. And so if that's what you're seeing happen in Thailand, I am very encouraged for its future.
Yeah, totally. And the things that you're talking about, I think even pre-pandemic have been important for us to understand better, and we're always trying to be better at that in trying to improving our workplaces. But I think what remote work has done is it has amplified those problems. Where if you have employees that don't feel fulfilled or they don't understand purpose, getting them to work remotely is not going to improve that situation. It's only going to make it harder to solve. So I think that's one of the things that we're very encouraged to see that organizations are paying more attention to that. Things that maybe we took for granted in the past. Now we understand that they don't happen automatically, or they don't happen without effort, and the right effort is being put at the moment in the right places.
So talk a little bit about the feedback that you're getting from employees on these topics about meaning and safety and better feedback. Yeah. Are there things that you've learned about what employees are saying right now and over the last year?
Yeah, it's a good question. So with Happily, because we ask questions and get feedback on a daily level, one of the questions we ask every day is, how are you feeling today? Right? And so we could help teams assess how they're doing in terms of happiness. Are they doing great? Are they just okay? Or are they not feeling well at all? What we were expecting to see was, because we've been doing this for a while, so we're expecting to see that during the pandemic, maybe happiness levels would have sunk a bit, right? It is a very highly stressful situation. Everybody we talk to say that they're working harder than ever before. Mm-hmm. And that we would always have thought that, okay, if we didn't have the right resilience in place, people working harder in a more stressful environment will equal unhappy employees. And that wasn't the case. We didn't see unhappiness drop at all. We did see it in certain days or events when, yes, they didn't feel safe, or maybe there was a bit of anticipation coming back into work, and maybe communication wasn't really done very well in the organization. Then we would see those dips, but we will also see those recoveries. So I think that's what we've been seeing from like being able to look at daily events and seeing the trends that are happening. We never saw that shock that people were expecting when the pandemic hit, when workplaces were being maybe some closing down, maybe their friends were losing work, and understandably so, people will be more stressed out. But it just didn't affect happiness as much as we thought it would be. It would. So I think that was good to see. But yes, feedback has been more oriented towards when we ask questions around what would they like their workplace to improve on, or what kind of resources did they need. It is now more about relationship building, that they feel isolated. They feel that with remote work, even having shifts of workforces coming in and out, they don't feel as connected as they did before. How do we solve that? I think as leaders, we also try to figure that out too, is that we know collaboration and innovation and creativity come from people connecting in it cannot be always structured. We can't set a time and a meeting place to be creative or to share ideas. It has to be able to flow all the time. Having communication tools and messaging tools in place does help a bit, but it doesn't solve the problem entirely. So I think those are now the conversations that we're having, and we're developing the tools at Happily to facilitate those kind of interactions between people.
Well, that's fabulous. I mean, I think that people are paying greater attention to, let's say, a need for relationship. Lines up pretty well with some quite modern and exciting research by a scientist named Senthil Mullainathan. So he talks about scarcity in his book, called Scarcity, in fact. And one of the pieces that caught my attention in what you were saying was that, listen, when we're deprived of time or money or connection with other humans, our whole mind begins to focus on it in a way that is not entirely controllable. And so if we've socially distanced from our peers and from our managers, we're going to crave that more because we just don't have the social contact that we did. So it's quite, I was kind of blown away when you were saying it, because I said, well, this is validation for his work. We're not crazy. When we don't have friends and family around us as regularly as we once did, we crave that more because we're social animals. So I'm very excited to hear that you're working in that space and that you're looking at tools that can help managers pay more better attention and to help peers interact more with each other. And it's exciting to me that companies also are fully aware of the need to connect people better. So thank you for sharing that.
No, I appreciate that, and there's a lot to learn from scarcity as well. As that our current times will again reinforce that kind of thinking, and then we have to figure out how that will affect behavior. I wanted to add as well, though, is that when we say that happiness hasn't decreased, I think a lot of credit goes to these organizations that understand that what they need to do in order to keep workplaces happy. So I think it was because there was effort being put in the right places, and so I think that's part of it too. But yes, you talked about relationships and connections with people, for sure. How could we facilitate that? And that was a big part of Happy's research before the pandemic hit as well. Just that understanding that to build the most successful teams, we need to have a lot more positive interactions between people than negative ones, right? I think there's the Lozado ratio that talks about you need to have, for every one negative interaction, you have to have 3 positive ones to make a successful team. When you work remotely or even in a highly stress-charged environment, you kind of tend to not have as many positive interactions as you normally would. How do we compensate for that? How do we make up for it? Because we can't just be okay not having them anymore. Mm-hmm. We know that over time, it will have detrimental effects to how productive we can be as employees, as teams, and as organizations. So I think that at Happily, we focus a lot on that building informal networks. Even when we're remote, how do we still initiate conversations between people so that they could talk about the things they should be talking about? And it is part of our daily pulse questions and creating conversation between the people that should be talking. And we're going to continue in that route.
Well, the Lozada ratio is one that I think would be a pretty useful rule of thumb for HR leaders, no? If you're collecting daily feedback, you need 3 positives to every negative that comes out. So that could be a neat way of moving beyond simple engagement with the app metrics.
Yeah, sure thing. And it talks about how part of their study was that the ratio of 3 to 1. They also saw teams that had more. If you have more than 11 to 1 ratio, that will actually went the other way, right? It wasn't a good thing. So it's not just maximizing it as much as possible. There is a point where it doesn't really help. But I think that partly, I think the thing that I take from that is not just about the number itself, because it is hard to measure. We don't want to get to a point where we're just measuring number of interactions we're having and which ones are positive and which ones are negative. I think it's more about understanding that positive interactions are important and paying more attention to them and saying that positive interactions do not, again, they don't happen without effort, and they don't happen, a lot of times they don't happen by accident. So we actually have to put in that effort, facilitate those activities. How, as HR, as people leaders, can be a better part of that? I've seen a lot of teams, come together, have these group Zoom meetings once a week where they focus on recognition and appreciation, and I think that's great. But I also feel that positive interaction isn't just about appreciation and recognition. I think you can also get critical feedback from someone and still have that be a positive interaction with someone, right? If it's done the right way. So I think that's what we're trying to look for, is that can we, as we develop our organizations and our teams going forward, focus on these positive interactions and make sure that all the interactions we have are positive, because they can be if they're done the right way.
Well, let's close this interview with that. So I like the critical feedback can be positive, and I think you kind of hit on it when you said 11 to 1 positive to negative is actually a bad thing also, or anything greater than that. And I think there's a lot that we can unpack in that conversation, but let's close with something easy, or easier anyway. How do you make, if you were to provide, let me say it like this, were you to provide some advice to business leaders, let's say not HR leaders for a moment, but business leaders, about how to have more positive critical feedback conversations, particularly when we don't get to see them, or maybe shake their hands or sit across the desk from each other. Could you give some advice to that business leader about how to have a positive critical feedback?
Sure. I mean, it's not an easy one, so
easier.
It's easier, maybe. Okay. I think there are 2 or 3 things, but we'll start with the most basic one, which is over-communicate, right? I think that especially when you're working remotely, just always tend to over-communicate rather than under-communicate. I think that solves a lot of problems that we have. Messaging someone on chat just because you need to get something done is not over-communicating. It's just about you're communicating because you need to. So I think that creating opportunities, or actually taking the effort to reach out to people in which you maybe normally won't. I think that just over-communicate in as many ways as you can. And when it's too much, people will let you know. I think so. I think that start with that. And I think secondly, part of the how do we make critical feedback positive as well. I think these are then skills that we should focus on more than ever. We always think, we always talk about that, and we talk about how do you give constructive feedback, how do we make these interactions between people better, and we train our leaders so that they're better at that too. But I think it's time to have this tool set or capability shared with everyone, that we can't only focus on just leaders alone to have this skill, that everybody in an organization needs to have this ability. And it's not something that's self-taught sometimes too. It takes a lot of time to learn how to give good feedback, and it helps a lot when you have someone help you, guide you through that process. I for sure needed that guidance when I went, at business school. It really changed the way I approached giving feedback to others. I think those are the kind of opportunities and resources that we need to make more available to our teams. And that even when you're working remotely, how do you communicate with others in a way that's positive, that it's not just about getting things done, because that's not enough anymore.